There's a story that once on a faraway island there lived a group of people who worshipped the sun, moon, and stars as their gods. They praised the sun at daybreak, the moon at twilight, and the stars through the night. They made animal sacrifices to earn the blessings of these celestial bodies. But then, some 1,200 years ago, two philosophers emerged from the desert. These two men were named Zerubbabel and Chor Matchin, and while living the life of ascetics in one of their home island's sandy wastes, they heard the voice of God, or the voice of a god. The voice allegedly called out, quote, "I am the Lord of the sun, moon, and stars, of the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all the things that are in them. I govern the creatures by the sun and moon and the 10 stars, and without me they cannot exist. Go and tell your people that God has appeared to you, and say, if they will worship and adore him, he will be their protector, and will appear to them in the churches, which they build to his honor, and promise them in my name that if they worship and obey me, they shall receive great rewards after this life." End quote. The two desert philosophers heard and obeyed. So they headed for the most holy site on their island, the mountain of Tanaleo, where they found a throng of their countrymen dutifully making their sacrifices to the sun. The two would-be prophets climbed to the most visible spot at the base of the holy mountain, and they yelled out to the crowd, quote, "O ye blind mortals who worship the stars so devoutly and are ignorant of the God who is above them, that God who created the sun and moon and all things in heaven and earth has this day taken pity on you and appeared to us and commanded us to declare him on to you." End quote. It was a bold gambit, but the crowd was intrigued. Who was this one supreme God that they spoke of? If this God was real, then how were they to worship him? The prophets, of course, had the answers. They explained to the curious islanders that, quote, if they would worship him according to his mind in an acceptable manner, they should first build him a temple, and in that they should make a tabernacle and an altar, and upon the altar they should burn 20,000 hearts of young children under 9 years of age. And when ye have done these things, then God will appear to you in this tabernacle and tell you what you are to do further for his service." End quote. Yes, the command of this mysterious God, according to these desert philosophers, was for the people of the island to build a temple and start sacrificing children. Well, this was too much for the gathered islanders. They were disgusted and outraged that these two would-be prophets would have them cut the hearts out of their own children. The mob pulled the two speakers from their makeshift pedestal and ran them back out to the desert, where it was agreed that they belonged. After expelling the prophets, the island was then beset by a series of strange and terrible occurrences. The sky over the island became dark, the air was filled with pestilence, and soon many were dying of plague. The earth was rent by a series of powerful earthquakes, and most horrific of all, the wild animals on the island converged on the cities, ran into people's homes, and ate the very children that they had hoped to save from the bloodthirsty prophets. It was now clear that the men from the desert had indeed been telling the truth. The God that had spoken to them was angry with the islanders for the treatment of his prophets. So the islanders returned to their holy mountain and cried out to the God that they now believed to be punishing them. They prayed to be delivered from these calamities and swore to follow this deity's every command. They humbled themselves before this God, and eventually he answered their prayers. He delivered to them a new prophet, a prophet who could heal the land and teach the islanders the way of this new religion. In the islanders' native tongue, he was called Psalmanazar, or the author of peace. Psalmanazar miraculously appeared before the people at the foot of the mountain, and from that day forth he was honored as their most wise and holy prophet. And so it was that at the direction of Psalmanazar, the people of the island built a huge temple in their capital. Within the temple was a tabernacle, or the spiritual heart of their religion, where God himself was said to appear in the form of a giant ox after the correct sacrifices were made. Psalmanazar gave the people of the island a new calendar that divided the year into 10 months. At the end of each 10-month cycle, a festival of 10 days would be held. It was on those 10 days that the sacrifices would take place. On each day of the festival, the hearts of 2,000 children would be burned in the ceremonial hearth. For the people of the island, the yearly sacrifice of 20,000 children soon became an honored tradition. And so it would remain well into the 18th century, when this account of the island's custom first started to circulate around Western Europe. The island that had embraced the religion of Psalmanazar was known at the time to the people of Europe as Formosa. But you might know this island better as Taiwan. Now, dear listeners, I feel like I can hear your brows collectively furrowing and your eyebrows arching quizzically. What? Did the people of Taiwan really once practice human sacrifice? Could they have really been led by a prophet named Psalmanazar? Nothing about that seems right. But then again, unless you happen to be Taiwanese or an expert in the topic, then how much do you really know about the history of Taiwan? That description of Formosan religion came from a book that was published in England in 1704, titled An Historical and Geographical Description of Formosa, an island subject to the Emperor of Japan. The book purported to be a complete guide to Formosa's history, politics, culture, religion, geography, food, flora, and fauna, all written from the perspective of a native Formosan, one George Psalmanazar. His surname, of course, was in honor of Formosa's great prophet, and his first name, well, that was the name he took in honor of his godfather when he was baptized into the Anglican faith. Yes, George Psalmanazar, native of Formosa, was an Anglican. This curious character arrived in London around 1703 and quickly became a bit of a local celebrity. The Anglican priest who had baptized Psalmanazar, one Alexander Innes, helped make introductions. The Bishop of London was particularly enamored with this exotic visitor, and soon other London notables were tripping over one another to invite the Formosan to dinner. And George Psalmanazar would prove to be a wonderfully entertaining dinner guest. Not only did he speak impeccable English, but he was happy to regale his hosts with colorful tales of life in Formosa. Even better, Psalmanazar insisted on taking his dinner in the traditional Formosan fashion. He would only eat raw meat, delicately spiced with cardamom. This exotic display never failed to delight all those in attendance. He was the perfect noble savage. He could discuss the finer points of Christian theology while gobbling down bloody chunks of uncooked beef. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about George Psalmanazar was that for all his exotic mannerisms, he seemed comfortingly familiar to his European hosts. This may have been because he looked just like his European hosts. And I don't mean that figuratively. George Psalmanazar looked like he had been born and raised in Northern Europe to European parents. He was light-skinned. He was blond. At least one person pointed out that he looked like he might be from the Netherlands. In other words, he didn't look Asian. But in the early 1700s in London, there were only a handful of people around who had genuinely met anyone from East Asia. There were a few missionaries and merchants who had made their way to China circulating in London society, but they were few and far between. Japan was even more mysterious to the English. Thanks to the exclusionary policies of the Tokugawa shogunate, only a handful of Dutch traders were permitted to interact with anyone from Japan. If Japan felt obscure, then Formosa was almost unknown. In England in 1704, even educated folks were largely ignorant of the history and culture of the island. It was deeply unclear what someone from Formosa was supposed to look like. What's more, George Psalmanazar's descriptions of his home island were so detailed and weirdly specific. In his book, Psalmanazar spent hundreds of pages explaining everything from the location of notable rivers to the island's complex political relationship with nearby Japan. The book was filled with illustrations showing everything from the unique fashions preferred by the Formosan aristocracy to the idols worshipped in the Formosan temples. What's more, Psalmanazar included a guide to help the curious learn the Formosan language. He laid out the entire Formosan alphabet and demonstrated the grammar and syntax of the language. He even included a complete Formosan translation of the Lord's Prayer so that it could be compared easily to the English version. Formosan appeared to be a legitimate language. George Psalmanazar, at least for a few years, was England's best source on the faraway island of Formosa. Even the prestigious Oxford University invited him to appear as a guest lecturer. But, as you may have already guessed, George Psalmanazar was not from Taiwan, nor was he from Japan, China, or anywhere else that could be reasonably considered Asia. George Psalmanazar looked so much like a European because he was a European. Everything he wrote about the island of Formosa was made up, or was a fantastical riff on other travel literature that he'd read. His language, while surprisingly functional, was a complete invention. As far as we know, he never traveled further east than modern Germany. And yet, his fraud was remarkably successful. He was able to get away with the ruse that he was from the island of Formosa for his entire life. It was only after he died, when his memoirs were published, that the extent of his hoax was finally revealed. But even then, the fraudster never revealed his real name. He's been remembered entirely by his alias, George Psalmanazar. The Formosan fraud has gone down as one of the most notorious hoaxes of the 18th century. While Psalmanazar's ruse was mostly harmless, the sheer audacity of his deception has continued to fascinate people. This is partially because Psalmanazar's disguise didn't include much of a costume. He didn't appear in London wearing makeup, nor did he dress up in someone's imagined idea of a Japanese kimono. He just went to dinner, looking like a typical 18th century Londoner. ate some raw meat, recited some tales about a faraway land, spoke a few words in an unplaceable language, and told everyone with a straight face that he was Asian. And it worked. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, Sebastian, didn't you just ruin the twist for us? Shouldn't you have drawn out this exploration only to expose the fraud during the exciting conclusion? And, I suppose that is one way that I could have approached this story. But I feel confident that most of you had already sniffed out the fake by the time I finished the tale of the prophet Psalmanazar and the 20,000 sacrificial hearts. As soon as you think about that story for a few seconds, it becomes obvious that it was made up by someone who had grown up in the Judeo-Christian tradition. A prophet hearing a voice in the desert, a holy mountain, God punishing his impious followers, a series of terrible plagues. I mean, this is Old Testament mix and match right here. Combine that with some garbled remembrances of what the Spanish had written about the Aztec Mexica civilization, and you have a story that most Europeans would have found both familiar and exotic. This deft combination of the foreign and the familiar may have been the key to Psalmanazar's success. When it comes to the strange case of George Psalmanazar, it's not interesting to discuss whether or not he was from Taiwan. He was not. It's not even particularly interesting to hunt for his real identity. What I'm interested in is exactly how and why he was able to convince so many people in 18th century London that he was the genuine article. How did this plucky imposter get away with it? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 167, Who Was the Fake Asian? Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, this is your friendly reminder that an ad-free version of this podcast can be found at patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Sign up at $5 or more every month and you'll get access to an ad-free feed and a buttload of other extras. And speaking of extras, so many of you have been asking me about this new Graham Hancock series on Netflix that I think I'm going to have to watch it and make an extra show with all my thoughts. This will be available on Patreon for anyone supporting at $3 or more, so keep a lookout for that. The holidays are fast approaching, so consider getting the OFH fan in your life some cool OFH merch for Hanukkah, Christmas, Saturnalia, or whatever gift-giving ceremony you prefer. Check out what's on offer by following the link at ourfakehistory.com or going to our TeePublic store. That's teepublic.com/stores/our-fake-history. This week, we are diving into one of the most audacious frauds of the early 18th century, the strange case of George Psalmanazar. Those of you who have been listening to this show for a while might know that on top of debunking fake history, I'm also interested in history's great fakes. Imposters, hucksters, and flim-flam artists are some of my favorite human beings to explore, especially when their ruses are relatively harmless. Now, that last point is crucial. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that some of history's most despicable figures are also among its most pernicious liars. My journey creating this podcast has given me a greater reverence for the idea of truth than I ever had before. As many have pointed out, we are living through an age where truth has become harder to grasp hold of. Social media has created an environment where it's easier than ever to create a hoax or spread misinformation. This has meant that more people are getting caught up in obvious deceptions, and conversely, very real things that need to be taken seriously are dismissed as frauds. This state of affairs can take some of the fun out of the study of imposters. I have very little patience for grifters and snake oil salesmen. But I still have a real place in my heart for what P.T. Barnum called humbug. These are benign deceptions, pranks that were ultimately designed to entertain. Humbugs are best when the people being pranked are the powerful, the self-important, or the pretentious. A well-constructed humbug can actually be clarifying. The fraud can sometimes point towards a bigger truth about those who have been deceived. Like the fable of the emperor's new clothes, the victim of the prank can be exposed as vain, incurious, or blinded by ego. Of course, the problem comes when we start debating who deserves to be deceived. Who is the emperor in this metaphor? Depending on your biases, political or otherwise, you might fill in that blank very differently from your neighbor. This is why even the most well-intentioned hoaxes are always playing with fire. Whether or not George Psalmanazar's hoax falls on the right side of what I'll call the humbug line is something I want you to think about as we get deeper into this story. Now, one of the things that makes this particular fraud so fascinating from a modern perspective is the level of detail that went into Psalmanazar's cover story, paired with the fact that he felt no need to disguise himself physically. He stood in front of some of the most learned people in London, looking completely European, right down to his blonde hair, and was able to convince them that he was from East Asia. I think this gives us an amazing little window into how people in Western Europe understood Asia and more broadly the concept of race in the early 18th century. So let's dive deeper into the life and lies of George Psalmanazar and see if we can gain some insight into his historical moment. Before we start picking apart George Psalmanazar's elaborate hoax, I think we need to establish some basic historical facts about the place that was so central to his ruse, the island of Taiwan. Now, here in 2022, Taiwan is famous as one of the world's great geopolitical hotspots. The island became the final outpost of the Chinese nationalist forces during China's Civil War. To this day, they still refer to the island and its government as the Republic of China. The Chinese Communist Party, the government of the mainland People's Republic of China, of course, does not recognize the legitimacy of this Taiwanese Republic of China. The official line from the People's Republic is that Taiwan is part of their sovereign jurisdiction. And it seems like a few times a year, tensions heat up and folks speculate about whether or not the People's Republic will invade the island, potentially triggering a world war. In 2022, Taiwan continues to matter. But the island's geography has always placed it at an interesting intersection of East Asian trade and culture. Despite the fact that there are two separate Chinese governments that currently claim sovereignty over Taiwan, ethnically Chinese people were not the first inhabitants of the island. The indigenous people of Taiwan spoke up to 26 Austronesian languages and have more in common linguistically and culturally with Filipinos and Polynesians than they do with people from mainland China. Chinese migration to the island came much later in its history. The indigenous people of Taiwan had lived and farmed on the island for over 5,000 years before the first Han Chinese fishermen started appearing in numbers around the 12th century AD. The name Formosa was given to the island by Portuguese sailors who came through the area in 1544. The Portuguese name Ilha Formosa translates basically as the beautiful island. They thought it looked nice. That name would end up becoming the name used by Europeans for the island for centuries. But it's worth remembering that neither the indigenous people of the island nor the Chinese islanders ever used the name Formosa themselves. For a period of time in the 17th century, the Dutch established a colonial presence on the western coast of the island. But by the early 1700s, when Psalmanazar was writing his book, the Dutch had been expelled. China had emerged from a period of political tumult and civil war, with the Qing dynasty now dominant. In 1684, Taiwan was officially annexed as part of the Qing Empire. But even then, the Chinese only really had a proper administrative presence on the western coast of the island. By the early 1700s, the Chinese emperors certainly claimed dominion over Taiwan, but most of the island, especially the eastern parts, were still largely controlled by the indigenous Taiwanese people. So, the island did have a genuinely unusual political situation in the early 1700s. It was home to a number of different cultures and different languages. There was not just one way to be Taiwanese or Formosan. The eastern parts of the island were even obscure to other Asians. This made it a fertile playground for a hoaxer like George Psalmanazar. If his stories about Formosa were ever challenged, even by someone who had legitimately visited the island, he could just say that he was talking about a part of the island that they had never been to. George Psalmanazar is a man who has two life stories. There is the fake life that he invented as part of his hoax, and then the quote-unquote real life that was only revealed to the world after his death in 1763. After he died, a book titled Memoirs of Blank, commonly known by the name George Psalmanazar, hit the shelves in Britain. In this book, the man who had some 60 years earlier masqueraded as a visitor from the island of Formosa came clean as an imposter. But the one thing he didn't reveal was his real name. Hence, the mysterious title, Memoirs of Blank. The blank is usually represented by 4 asterisks. So, those of us interested in this case are stuck calling him by his alias. Now, one thing that struck me when I was researching this was that the version of events that often gets presented as the real story by modern commentators is usually taken entirely from Psalmanazar's posthumous memoir. But I think it needs to be recognized that the author of that memoir is an unreliable narrator. Even the story that is presented in the memoir as a penitent act of truth-telling is still being written by a man who was famously an excellent liar. So I think we should even take the so-called true story with a large serving of salt. Anyway, let's start with the fake version of Psalmanazar's life. His story begins, where else? On the island of Formosa, where he was the son of a wealthy Formosan nobleman. Formosa, he tells his readers, was part of the Japanese Empire. While it had a thriving local culture, the nobles of the island recognized the sovereignty of the Japanese emperor. Now, as we have already established, in 1704, this was entirely false. The Japanese had no presence in Formosa. Anyway, Psalmanazar tells his reader that he was convinced to leave his home and travel to France by a Jesuit who had been living in Formosa and posing as a Japanese-born Latin teacher. Yes, that's right. According to Psalmanazar's story, a French Jesuit successfully passed himself off as a Japanese man who spoke Latin. Now, I can't help but notice that this detail seems awfully close to Psalmanazar's own hoax. Was he giving his readers a little clue? Who's to say? It was eventually revealed that Psalmanazar's Jesuit tutor was not a Japanese man at all, but in fact a certain Father de Rode from Avignon, France. The young Psalmanazar was seduced by tales of adventure, and he agreed to leave home and accompany the Jesuit back to Europe. Once in France, the Jesuit became intent on converting the young Formosan to Roman Catholicism. But George Psalmanazar resisted every attempt to be baptized in the Catholic faith. He eventually escaped from Father de Rode and a band of inquisitors who would have him convert or else face execution. He then traveled through a number of German principalities, France, and the Low Countries. As he traveled, he met people and questioned them about their chosen religion. As he made his way around Europe, the Formosan debated the merits of a number of different varieties of Christianity, in particular Lutheranism and Calvinism. Eventually, he met an Anglican priest by the name of Alexander Innes, who convinced the Formosan that the teachings of the Church of England were in fact the most divinely inspired. And so, Psalmanazar became George the Anglican. Innes, the Anglican priest, also thought that the Bishop of London would like to meet this enthusiastic young convert and learn what he could about the faraway island of Formosa. And so it was that an introduction was made. When Psalmanazar made his debut on the London social scene, this was the picaresque tale he told when asked how he found himself in that city. The real story, at least according to his memoir, was rather different. The author reveals that he was born somewhere in Western Europe, probably southern France. He tells us that he was raised by his mother while his father lived a few hundred miles away in one of the German-speaking parts of the continent. He was educated in various Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit schools in Avignon. It should therefore come as no surprise that the city of Avignon played such a key role in his fake life story as a Formosan. Psalmanazar tells us that as a kid, he had a real talent for learning languages and was a particularly adept student of Latin. Now, considering that he would eventually invent a fairly believable fake language, there's little reason to doubt this. But he eventually grew dissatisfied with his stodgy teachers, and he left school at the age of 16. He made a living for a little while as a Latin tutor in Avignon, before becoming so embroiled in debt that he was reduced to begging on the streets. So, if we're trying to answer the question of why Psalmanazar cooked up this wild hoax, part of the reason was clearly money. Now, as we will see, being a fake Formosan didn't really make him rich, but this was a guy who had experienced real poverty. So anything that could keep him off the street certainly felt like a step up. According to his memoir, it was during this time living off the charity of others that Psalmanazar first experimented with a fake identity. He was trying to get enough money to hopefully make his way back to his mother's house when he started telling the curious that he was actually an Irish Catholic on a pilgrimage to Rome. His story was that he was fleeing religious persecution in Ireland at the hands of Protestants. This story, paired with his clever use of Latin, seemed to work well on Roman Catholic clergymen who became generous with their handouts after hearing his tale of woe. Psalmanazar eventually made his way home to his mother, but job opportunities in his hometown were not much better than in Avignon. So he made his way to see his father, who advised him to go to Holland, where there seemed to be more opportunity. Psalmanazar did just that, once again paying for his travel by begging. But at this point, he realized that his Irish disguise was becoming a little too risky. He didn't really know a lot about Ireland, and it was highly likely that he might bump into a real Irish person, or someone familiar enough with Ireland that they could easily blow his cover. So he invented a more exotic disguise. As he made his way to Holland, George Psalmanazar started presenting himself as Japanese. This was when he first concocted the story that he had been brought to Europe by Jesuit tutors. He was now a lost traveler, far from his homeland, ready to be converted to whichever brand of Christianity seemed the best. He found that presenting himself as a naive foreigner eager to learn about which religion was the truest played well in early 18th century Europe. It was at this time that he first started creating his fake language to make his disguise seem even more convincing. He created an entire alphabet and carried a notebook filled with what he claimed were prayers and songs composed in Japanese. Now, it was actually a gibberish of his own creation, but it was a very language-like gibberish. And this really seemed to help convince the skeptical that he truly was from Asia. But even though Japan was a very obscure place to most Europeans in the early 18th century, he found that well-read folks knew just enough about it to make them suspicious of him. So, Psalmanazar switched his fake homeland one final time to Formosa, the most distant and poorly understood place he could think of. He now claimed that his fake language was in fact Formosan. Even better, the obscurity of Formosa meant that he could make up almost anything about the place, and very few people were equipped with any information that could contradict him. It was in this guise that he eventually found work as a soldier, enlisting in a Dutch army regiment. Apparently, he had a reputation for chanting his made-up language from his fake Formosan prayer book while his Dutch Calvinist comrades solemnly said their prayers. As such, he became a bit of a curiosity in his regiment. But he was entertaining enough that one night his commanding officer invited Psalmanazar to his home where he was entertaining a guest from England, the Anglican priest Alexander Innes. Now, it's unclear if this commanding officer truly believed Psalmanazar was from Formosa or if he just thought that he was an entertaining eccentric, but either way, he thought that Psalmanazar would make good company at dinner. Alexander Innes was immediately charmed by Psalmanazar and delighted in his wild stories about Formosa. But Innes was also the first person we know for sure saw through the act. Innes came up with a very clever test to see if Psalmanazar was authentic, and especially if his language was the real deal. Innes gave Psalmanazar a passage in Latin and asked him to write it out in his native Formosan language. Psalmanazar hopped right to it, quickly created a translation, and then handed it back to the priest. Innes looked it over, then passed the Formosan text back to Psalmanazar, took away the Latin original, and said, "All right, now using your Formosan copy, translate this back into Latin." Psalmanazar tried to bluff his way through this by writing what he could remember from the Latin original, but the result was so bad that it was clear that he had been caught. But Innes didn't reveal him in that moment. Instead, he kind of winked at Psalmanazar and told him that he should really be more vigilant in the future. From then on, Alexander Innes became just as much a part of the fraud as Psalmanazar himself. It was Innes's idea that Psalmanazar should be baptized as an Anglican and that he should bring his charade to England. Now, somehow, and the details here are very hazy, but Psalmanazar was freed from his service in Holland and traveled with Innes to London. From there, Innes used his entertaining companion as essentially a prank on London society. Now, Innes's goals in all of this are kind of hard to understand. There wasn't much money to be made in this hoax. The little money that did come in as a result of the eventual book sales all went to Psalmanazar. Innes just seems to have been a bit of a libertine who loved the chaos of it all. Let's just say he didn't seem to be overly concerned with his vows as a priest. In the memoirs, Psalmanazar tells us that while in London, Innes hosted wild parties, chased women relentlessly, and drank wine with a passion. It was Innes who introduced Psalmanazar to the Bishop of London and other key aristocratic socialites. Soon, the story of the curious Formosan spread, and he became one of the most in-demand dinner guests in the city. And to his credit, Psalmanazar capitalized on his moment of notoriety. Within a year of arriving in London, he had written and published an historical and geographical description of Formosa, a fairly thick tome describing every aspect of Formosan culture and language. So, I'm sure you're asking, wasn't anyone skeptical? Did these Londoners really believe that a blond man who looked an awful lot like someone from France was actually a native of Taiwan? Were they just playing along for the fun of it? Or did this hoax actually work? Well, I think some of this can be answered if we look at George Psalmanazar's appearance before England's august Royal Society in 1704. So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll see how George Psalmanazar faced his critics. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming, like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking, or your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find that perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive or collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Arguably, the most important chapter in the George Psalmanazar hoax was his appearance before the Royal Society in 1704. If he had just managed to dupe some gullible aristocrats around London dinner tables, he may have not been remembered. But in 1704, he was invited to appear before the most esteemed collection of scholars in all of Britain. The Royal Society had been founded in 1660 and had developed into one of the foremost academic societies in the world by the early 18th century. In fact, the Royal Society is still around in the UK today and enjoys the distinction of being the world's oldest continuously existing scientific academy. When George Psalmanazar was summoned before the Royal Society, the president was none other than the venerable Sir Isaac Newton himself. Now, before we get too excited, there isn't any evidence that Isaac Newton was in the crowd the night that Psalmanazar was examined. I have read some colorful imaginings of the event that like to place the famous scientist in the crowd. It's possible that he was there, but if he was not recorded as to having said anything. And if Newton had been there, I'm sure Psalmanazar would have almost certainly said something about it in his memoir. But he makes no mention of him. Anyway, as you might expect, it was at the Royal Society that Psalmanazar met with his most skeptical audience. But interestingly, the questions asked by the society didn't concentrate particularly heavily on his appearance. We're told that Psalmanazar appeared before the society, shared his tales about Formosa, presented the Formosan alphabet, and spoke in the language as a demonstration. He also spoke about the political and cultural life of Formosa. Now, one of the key parts of Psalmanazar's story was that Formosa was technically part of the Japanese Empire, and the Formosan lords were clients of the Emperor of Japan. This is where he met with his first challenge from someone who had actually traveled to East Asia. In attendance that night was a certain Jean de Fontenay, a Jesuit priest who had spent 14 years in China, although he had never traveled to Formosa himself. Fontenay challenged Psalmanazar by saying that he knew for a fact that Formosa, an island the Chinese called Taiwan, was actually part of the Chinese Empire and not the Japanese Empire. But Psalmanazar was incredibly quick on his feet. He deftly replied that this Taiwan that Fontenay spoke of was actually a different island altogether, just off the west coast of Formosa. The Dutch had had a colony on Taiwan, and the Chinese now controlled that island. His island, Formosa, was controlled by Japan. Furthermore, no European travelers had any reliable information about the east side of the island. Psalmanazar then played to the prejudices of his English audience. He pointed out that his accuser was a Catholic Jesuit, and as such, couldn't be trusted. This quick response, coupled with Psalmanazar's demonstration of his language, seems to have totally confounded Fontenay. The Jesuit remained convinced that Psalmanazar was a fraud, but he wasn't able to prove it. In fact, he was unable to make any other meaningful objections that night which have survived in the sources. The other notable skeptic was the famous 18th century astronomer Edmund Halley. And yes, this is the same Halley who would give his name to Halley's Comet. For his part, Halley seems to be one of the only people to really grill Psalmanazar on why he looked the way he did. Now, some sources I've read say that he brought up his objections at the Royal Society. In Psalmanazar's memoir, he tells us that Halley questioned him semi-privately in a tavern. In either case, Halley had some very probing questions. Now, Halley's questions and Psalmanazar's retorts tell us quite a lot about how ethnicity and skin color was understood in the early 1700s. Halley's reading had told him that Formosa was located near the Tropic of Cancer. Someone from a tropical place would naturally be exposed more directly to the hot tropical sun. In the early 1700s, it was believed that your exposure to the sun during your lifetime was the most important element in determining your skin color. Now, people did understand that your parentage had something to do with the color of your skin, but it wasn't recognized as the most essential ingredient in skin color. Halley peppered Psalmanazar with a number of questions befitting an astronomer. He asked him how long the days were in Formosa and how high the sun was in the sky at noon. Presumably, this was done to see if Psalmanazar's answers aligned with what he knew about the position of the sun when observed from the tropics. We're told that Psalmanazar answered these questions accurately enough. But it turns out this was all just a setup for Halley's big question. If the sun was as powerful in Formosa as Psalmanazar's answers would suggest, then how was it that he had such light skin? Psalmanazar was once again quick on his feet. He said that his skin was light because he was an upper-class Formosan. In Formosa, the aristocrats always stay in the shade, and they build their homes underground. As such, their skin stays as fair as someone born in London. Well, at first, Halley wasn't having this. He said that these underground houses surely had chimneys for the fires. If he was not mistaken, when the sun was at the highest point in the sky, it would then shine down these chimneys, and as a result, change the skin color of those dwelling within. To this, Psalmanazar countered with the claim that the chimneys in Formosa all had 90-degree bends in them, so the sun couldn't shine in. Now, if we believe our sources, this essentially ended Halley's inquiry into the matter. In the end, it seems like most of the best minds in London remained skeptical, but they were ultimately unable to prove that he wasn't from Formosa. Now, this brings us to what I think is the most fascinating part of this case. It can sometimes be hard to put yourself in the headspace of people from the past and truly inhabit a different mindset. But to understand this hoax, you have to try and see the world the way people in 18th century London saw the world. We've spoken on this podcast before about the history of race as an idea. We've explored how racial categories were created over time. When we looked at the history of Louisiana, for instance, when we explored the story of Marie Laveau, we talked about how someone's race might change depending on which colonial power controlled that territory, as the French, Spanish, and Anglo-Americans all had different ideas about what made someone one race or another around the turn of the 19th century. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that the racial categories we might recognize today were fully formalized. When people say that race is a construction, they're not saying that differences in skin color don't exist. Instead, what they're saying is that creating a distinct group of humanity based on a somewhat arbitrary collection of physical characteristics is unscientific. If you have mixed parentage, then these racial categories very quickly break down. We can trace historically when and how these rigid racial categories were invented, given the veneer of scientific authority, and then violently policed. Now, in 2022, when someone says they don't see race, many of us roll our eyes. It always comes off as disingenuous. The racial categories that were formalized in the 19th century have had such a deep impact on our history, politics, and culture since that time that it can be hard to take an adult seriously when they say that they somehow do not see those things. But, with all that said, allow me to suggest the idea that the people that encountered George Psalmanazar in London in the early 18th century did not see race. Or rather, they didn't see it the way we see it. Racial categories as they would come to be were just starting to be formulated in the early 1700s. This is how someone like George Psalmanazar could get away with his hoax. Up to that point in history, your ethnicity had less to do with how you looked and more to do with the language you spoke, the religion you practiced, the food you ate, and the customs you observed. For most of the 17th century, it was not widely accepted that Europeans with light skin were all part of one consistent racial group. Historians have pointed out that while white as a descriptor for skin color can be found in ancient sources, the idea of a white or Caucasian identity only first started being articulated near the end of the 1600s. In 1704, the idea was around, but it was hardly widely understood and accepted. Instead, it was believed that English, French, German, and Dutch folks were all different, even though they kind of looked alike. The most obvious thing that made them different was language, and George Psalmanazar had his own language. He was able to present an entire alphabet and had even translated the Lord's Prayer into Formosan. This was considered a very good indicator of one's place of origin, perhaps even more so than the color of one's skin. I think it's notable that the Jesuit priest de Fontenay, who questioned Psalmanazar at the Royal Society, never once brought up the fact that Psalmanazar did not look like any of the Chinese people that he had lived amongst for the past 14 years. He didn't think to challenge Psalmanazar on those grounds, because Psalmanazar did not claim to be Chinese. He was Formosan, and at the time, there wasn't a quote-unquote Asian racial category that he was supposed to fit into. Why should people from Formosa look like people from China? So Fontenay didn't even bother to go down that path. All of his questions had to do with the political status of Formosa. When Psalmanazar stood in front of the Royal Society, no one said, "Hey, you're clearly not an Asian," because Asian as a set of physical attributes had not yet been formalized. The scholar, Michael Kivak, whose book on Psalmanazar, The Pretended Asian, is probably one of the best out there, has suggested a few other elements that might explain why the Formosan fraud was so successful. First is the fact that even the supposedly reputable European descriptions of Formosa were also filled with errors and some pretty wild descriptions. At the time, the best account of Formosa available to Europeans, not written by Psalmanazar, was penned by a Dutch missionary named George Candidus, who had lived on the island for 10 years while it was still, at least partially, a Dutch colony. Now, he was a first-hand eyewitness, but some of his descriptions of Formosan culture are just as wild and inaccurate as some of the things invented by Psalmanazar. Notoriously, Candidus wrote that women in Formosa were forbade from having children until they were at least 37 years old. If a woman should get pregnant before that time, she was forced to terminate the pregnancy. Candidus then goes on to describe an elaborate and honestly quite upsetting ritual through which these abortions were allegedly performed. I will spare you the details. Look it up if you're curious. I bring this up not to be gratuitous, but only to point out that he seems to have made this ritual up. There's no evidence that this type of practice was ever undertaken on Taiwan by indigenous people or Chinese islanders. So, when your reputable source has passages like that, Psalmanazar's descriptions of human sacrifice don't sound as far-fetched. Secondly, Kivak has pointed out that there were things about Psalmanazar's story and the man himself that made his English audience more amenable to his description of Formosa. Kivak has argued that Psalmanazar's deception was based on a careful balance between the exotic and the familiar. When reading an historical and geographical description of Formosa, one can't help but notice how much time the author spends discussing religion. His description of Formosan religion is both exotic and rather familiar. The story of the prophet Psalmanazar echoes certain Old Testament tales, with just a splash of Jesus thrown in. But the story is also spiced with exotic details, clearly borrowed from descriptions of the Mexica civilization that had been circulated by the Spanish after the conquest. But beyond that, Psalmanazar spends pages discussing Christian theology, outlining all of his arguments against various Catholic and Calvinist pieces of dogma, before explaining why he ultimately embraced Anglicanism. These large sections on Christian theology can seem somewhat extraneous in a book that's supposed to be about the island of Formosa, but it makes more sense when you realize that this was a key part of his disguise. The idea of an intelligent foreigner so eloquently expressing why Anglican theology was superior to that of the Roman Catholics, Calvinists, and Lutherans was flattering to English sensibilities. They wanted him to be a real Formosan, because then that would act as evidence that Anglicanism really was the best version of Christianity. Psalmanazar's entire presentation of himself at dinner parties was also a mingling of the exotic and the familiar. He could carry on conversations, spin yarns. He conducted himself with the appropriate manners until the food was served, at which point he would gleefully gobble down a bunch of raw meat to everyone's amusement. He was different enough to be entertaining, but not so different that the English dinner guests couldn't relate to him. Psalmanazar's other great trick was that he never contradicted himself. His story grew, but he never offered a new detail that contradicted a detail that he had invented earlier. He would write, quote, "When any question had been started on a sudden, I seldom found myself at a loss for a quick answer, which, if satisfactory, I stored up in my retentive memory. There was one maxim I could never be prevailed upon to depart from, that whatever I had once affirmed, though ever so improbable or even absurd, should never be amended or contradicted." End quote. So the final ingredient was Psalmanazar's own skill as a liar. He was very good at keeping track of the tangled web he was weaving. Michael Kivak puts this all together, writing, quote, "If Psalmanazar was able to succeed, then it was because, to be Formosan, he simply had to dress, speak, and act like one, a designation that circularly was defined by the way he spoke, dressed, and acted. It hardly mattered whether one's dress, language, and actions were quote-unquote authentic, since it was more important to just be different, alien, and unfamiliar. Yet, at the same time, his differences had to be assimilable." End quote. He was foreign, and yet he was familiar. If you were an Anglican and you believed his story, then you got the ego pump of believing that an objective foreigner thought your religion was the best. Finally, the man could not be caught in a lie. Even the most learned men in England couldn't conclusively prove that he wasn't who he said he was, and Formosa wasn't as he described it. While Psalmanazar's ruse was never properly revealed, his fame seems to have been relatively short-lived. After he published his description of the island of Formosa, Psalmanazar received an invitation to stay and study at Oxford, where eventually it was hoped that he would teach a few classes on Formosan. However, there's no evidence that he ever actually gave a lecture at the university. We're told that he stayed in Oxford for a few months and audited a few courses. He even kept up the ruse that he was a dedicated student by conspicuously keeping a candle lit in his window through the night, so his neighbors would think that he was burning the midnight oil pouring over his books. He eventually left Oxford, only to discover that his partner in crime, Alexander Innes, had left London to take a cushy church position in sunny Portugal. After that, the game was essentially over. Psalmanazar would publish a few more books over the course of the next few years, many of which were marketed as defenses against those who would claim that he was not Formosan. These sold modestly, but eventually London society seems to have simply moved on from him. In 1723, the famous satirist Jonathan Swift made a passing reference to Psalmanazar in his famous satirical essay, A Modest Proposal. The reference winkingly suggests that by that point, most folks had written off Psalmanazar as a bit of a joke, even if they couldn't conclusively prove that his story was false. For his part, Psalmanazar never really let the disguise drop, but in later years, he seems to have stopped talking about Formosa much. He eventually found work as one of London's so-called Grub Street writers. These were essentially freelance writers who were commissioned to write prefaces to history books, add entries to collections, and generally do bits of writing more established authors couldn't be bothered with. They were essentially creating the BuzzFeed listicles of the 18th century. He eked out an existence in that way until his death, until 1763. Then came the final act, the publication of the memoirs, when the story of George Psalmanazar was milked for one last trip to the presses. However, this time it was in the form of a penitent confession. The Psalmanazar case was mostly a harmless humbug, a prank on London society, and a challenge to those Royal Society scholars who were perhaps overly confident in their powers of examination. Psalmanazar has been remembered as a curio of a different time. Early editions of his book, Descriptions of Formosa, complete with Psalmanazar's original illustrations, have become highly sought after amongst collectors of literary curiosities. Like most people, I find Psalmanazar's case pretty amusing. The audacity of it, the sheer chutzpah this man needed to have to lie so convincingly and so theatrically in front of so many people is impressive. I'm also fascinated by how Psalmanazar's case underscores the different way that earlier people perceived race and ethnicity. Now, many people find it hard to accept that race is a cultural and historical construction, and I understand why. It feels counterintuitive. But historical episodes like this really demonstrate that there was a time and a place when people did not see race the way we see it now. In the end, I think that George Psalmanazar was mostly a harmless prankster. Sure, he managed to swindle the gullible and curious who bought his books out of a few pounds. He also muddied the waters when it came to the European understanding of Taiwan, Japan, and East Asia generally. But Psalmanazar's inventions about Formosa were largely forgotten by the mid-1700s. His lies about Asia never really calcified into stereotypes. If they had, well, then we might remember him differently. But with that said, there is something a little sinister at the core of the Psalmanazar story. He reminds us that if someone tells a lie consistently and with confidence, no matter how absurd it might sound, there will always be someone who believes it. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will explore another historical myth. Before we go this week, I need to give a shout out to the following people. Big ups to Gwydion Duve. And happy birthday, Gwydion. I'm glad you are listening to Our Fake History. I also want to shout out Philip Hightower, Eric Lee, Tim Van Doren, Mark Crawford, Tyler, Jeff Bunny, Sonia Howard, Jennifer Brett, and Stephen Olson. All of these people have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you again for your support of this podcast. I really could not do it without all of you. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always hit me up at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. And you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory. The website for the show is ourfakehistory.com. There's lots of cool stuff to check out there as well. The theme music for the show comes to us, as always, from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
What's up, everybody? It's All-Star and World Series champ Nick Swisher here, and I'm stoked to tell you about my new podcast, The Nick Swisher Show, right here on PodcastOne. If you know me, you know I've worn a lot of hats in my career, and each one of them has had highs, lows, and a whole lot of learning in between. And that's exactly what I'm bringing to this podcast. You're going to get crazy interviews with athletes from their struggles to their successes and all their unbelievable superstitions along the way. You're going to hear from hometown heroes that are stepping up to the plate and making positive change and influences in their communities. I mean, we've got scientists, coaches, comedians. I'm telling you, whether you're an athlete, a parent, a coach, or just looking for a little energy in your life, then home plate is right here. It's old school soul with new school vibes. It's the Nick Swisher Show, coming soon wherever you get your podcasts.